So thanks to the RVA JS crew for having me here today. A little background real quick. I hold a master's in architecture of the building variety, but I've only done design in architecture with a greenhouse and a chicken coop. So I pretty much went into doing web and 3D straight out of school and never looked back. I do a little bit of permaculture. I've got a small farm outside of Charlottesville. So if that's something that interests you as well, I'd love to talk with you later about that. But that's not the talk we're doing today, no permaculture. I am the head of design for CargoSense, but I'm also the entirety of the design team. It means the meetings are very short. But we are a logistics startup doing big data stuff with a lot of pharmaceuticals. We work with United on their PetSafe program to help them get real data now after they've had some of those fiascos last year. And we build things in Elixir, GraphQL, React, and more. Before that, I was at Living Social, and I ran the UX for the internal tools team. It was 4 of us, UX and front-end development combined. And that was Backbone and a little bit of just vanilla JavaScript stuff. And then I've run this since 1997. This is kind of my UX consulting, training, mentoring thing. And you may have heard of me from this book I co-authored with Bruce Williams. So I have very strong opinions if you ever want to talk about this. So let's get started. I'm going to throw down the gauntlet right now. UX debt is technical debt. We're going to come back to this as we get through this, but if nothing else today, I want you to remember these 5 words, and I want you to take this home with you. So some definitions. So much of this stuff gets thrown around as these terms, and yeah, okay, oh yeah, you know, well, my UX guy is going to work on the IA, and we'll get some good CX happening, and you know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. What is all this crap? It all comes back to this. It's experience, right? So you can slice and dice it any way you want. You can say, we're talking about the experience of using an app or walking through a building or trying to get through to a live human on those awful call centers where all you have to do is keep yelling, operator, operator, operator. And finally, the things like, okay, I'm connecting you to somebody now. But as a discipline, it's pretty broad. These are all, I love this graphic because it shows you kind of like how much of this stuff is really all over the place. And people just think of, they say UI UX. Well, we've got sound design, we've got audio engineering, we've got human factors, we've got psychology, sociology, information architecture, computer science in the bottom left here, writing, copywriting. How many of you guys have had to do copywriting? How many of you guys know how painful copywriting and bad copy is in a web app? All of you should have had some experience where you read something and you were like, that makes no sense, who wrote this? So with all these disciplines, we also have a problem of job titles, right? I'm assuming most everybody here at this conference at least does something, dabbling-wise, on the right side of this spectrum. Some of you may go further into the left. How many of you guys would call yourselves this kind of UX engineer, where you kind of are tasked with doing all of these things, including the build? A couple of you, okay. Most of you, I think, would agree that you do front-end development. Okay, so a lot of this stuff is not necessarily that these are magical things over here on the left. It's just a broad spectrum, and the goal is to kind of understand that spectrum and work your way into the left. So what is UX and why should you care? Besides my gauntlet throwing at the beginning, let's get into what actually UX is as we're going to define it. So UX is 5 factors as defined by Jacob Nielsen, who is probably the most conservative, not politically, but conservative UX practitioner out there. So the first one is the promptness with which the users learn something, the efficiency they attain while making use of it, how easy it is for them to remember it, how error-prone it is, and the level of satisfaction they attain from using it. So those 5 factors, if you can do well in most of these, then you're doing pretty well, you know, from a usability perspective. There's always room for improvement, but if you're floating these 5 boats, users are pretty happy. The next term you hear thrown around all the time, Harvard Business Review and whatnot, is this design thinking. It's gotten a bad rap a little bit lately, and we'll talk about it in a second, but it came out of IDEO. Tim Brown, who's the CEO there, they're a product company, and they've been one of the biggest product companies out there. So it's innovation, but it's powered by direct observation of what people want and need in their daily lives, and what they like or dislike about the way particular products are not just used, but how they're made, how they're packaged, how you interact with them, how you hear about them, how they're marketed, all these things. And it's a discipline that uses the designer's sensibility to match people's needs between what's technologically feasible and what's viable for the business. Sounds like a lot of the stuff we kind of do, and just phrased a little differently. It's been beaten up recently because a lot of people are doing what has been dubbed innovation theater. They say, we're design thinkers, we do this, and then they have a room called Design War Room and DVD storage. You're doing it wrong. That's not, when it's sidelined like that, and then it's like, oh, we have Post-it notes, and we've got markers, and yeah, people go in and work on the product. It's not part of the culture. It's not the underpinning foundational way they build products. It's show and tell, and look at this wonderful thing we do, which means it's junk. So people now, in the same way people have complained about Agile, it's a similar issue that's happening where people are saying, we do Agile, and you're like, you don't even understand the manifesto. So let's rewind. Lean. So this is Taiichi Ono. He was the founder of the Toyota production system, which is where the concepts of what we call lean came from. Taiichi-san basically took these concepts and said that the present capacity is your work plus your waste. So you want to minimize the waste. And by observing the factory floor and looking at how people did things and seeing where these inefficiencies were, his efforts led to an 8.3 times size profit margin in the early 2000s for Toyota over the rest of the industry. So they were blowing everybody out of the water from a profit perspective. This stuff came to America really in 96-ish with a book called Lean Thinking. And this is kind of like 5 of the big concepts out of there. And this stuff seems pretty familiar for what a lot of the things that we do when we talk about lean startup are. So lean startup is the famous build, measure, learn. It's the kind of the iterative process we like to do on product development when we're working in software. But if you take all this stuff out, put it together, you end up with what we call lean UX. So this is from the Nordstrom Design Lab or Innovation Lab. The orange on the left is what we call design thinking. Lean startup is the red, and then agile is the blue. So these aren't competing methodologies. These aren't competing concepts. They all go together. And if you can read it at the top, design thinking discovers customers. So by going through a design thinking process of observing, defining the challenges, forming insights, all these things, that helps you start to figure out what's going on. So lean UX is the practice of bringing the true nature of a product to light faster. It's collaborative in a cross-functional way, and we build shared understanding. So now that we've got those terms kind of baked, the why. Again, UX debt is technical debt. If you aren't working on it, you're building up a backlog. It's going to hurt your app at your tool at some point, and it will take a long time to go back and refactor all that stuff out and rebuild it. So many of these UX issues severely affect the front-end engineering side. That's where a lot of these things collide. Between, the back end, okay, it passes unit tests, it serves the JSON file, we're happy, that works, thumbs up. Now, how I interact with that, though, that's where most of our front-end development works. Likewise, we're actually kind of counter to that, just a good-looking app does not mean you have a usable app. Dribbble will prove this to you. There are 400,000 weather apps, and none of them have the main question my wife asks every morning: do I need to put our 3 kids in raincoats? And so if you it's like, but look at this beautiful display. I've got clouds, and it says 70 in a nice thin Helvetica font. No, that's not experience. That's just pretty. So the next thing to think about, though, is that experience is everyone's problem. If design is an isolated discipline, it's going to be problematic in the long term. It's not magical and mystical. Design's a process. It's a way to solve a problem. And too many times it's relegated to this expert in Photoshop that sits in the corner. I want to introduce you to Ed Catmull here on the right. Ed Catmull is about to retire, actually, as the president of Pixar. You may have heard of him. You have definitely used his technology. The stuff he invented in the 70s is pretty much used underlying all graphics in computer systems. He and the team at Pixar are actually to blame for a lot of what Steve Jobs learned before coming back to Apple on how to do creative management. And some of the quotes from this book, which is just, the whole thing is quotable. It's an amazing book. If there's more truth in hallway than in meetings, you have a problem. So if Jobs would go to Pixar, and Catmull got him to start doing this, where he'd go up to somebody and say, what's something great at Pixar? And he'd force them to give a good answer. You're not just like, don't give me a softball here, like tell me something great. What's something that's bad at Pixar? And he'd pull it out of them. All those bad things, they were like, we need to fix that. And they just do this constantly. So celebrating the good, fixing the bad. But it made it an environment where these things, people weren't whispering in the hallways, God, I hate when so-and-so does blah, blah, blah. They could be like, yeah, I don't like how this works. Okay, let's fix it. These ideas come from everywhere. Product people, engineers, QA, design, customer support is one of the best because they're the ones that hear the complaints every single day on the phone. If you're discounting any of these sources of ideas for the product, it's going to hurt your product. Accounting, people like that even, sometimes just throw random things out there and like you need to capture those, bring them in, talk about them, beat them up, see how they fare. Can we work with this? Is this something that we can try? We'll get into that in a second of how we do that. The other one is this is how it's always been done. You're protecting the past, not protecting the future. And so that's an important thing to think of too when people shut down ideas. Why are they shutting them down? Are they protecting this? This is how we do things. This is how I'm comfortable. Finally, you need to compete. So I did a bunch of consulting work for Procore, which is a construction management software. And when I showed up, they had one designer that was handling all the design, kind of trying to make a massive 9-module app stable with 40 engineers and just keep the UI from drifting. It was kind of derivative of early Basecamp. And I kind of went in there and kind of started helping them figure out where they wanted to go and look at some of the flows. And one of the things that we had a discussion with the upper management is that's great that you're the industry leader for architectural construction management software. How do you compare to QuickBooks Online? How do you compare to Google? How do you compare to industry leaders and other things? Because even though you may be the current hotness in your industry, everyone else is trying to beat you. And the only way if you sit there and say, we're good enough, someone's going to pass you. You need to be always looking for the top. And so we went in and did a little pitch. We did a couple screen mock-ups and concepts and kind of rebranded it and said, here's how the site could look. And they had never thought about what could be. And so this is just kind of a vision board. And we were able to take this and sell them on the concept, and the company ended up building out a massive UX team as the engineering team grew. And the app looks nothing like this now, which is hilarious because it's been now, I stopped working with them in 2015 as I kind of handed off to the team. But it's all these things that were concepts, like you can still see a lot of the stuff in there now with data hierarchy and all these fixes and all this testing. And we would put this in front of architects and builders and get feedback and go rev it and go put it back in front of them and go back and rev it. And so we had like a clickable prototype that was just static screens. But getting that out there, and pushing that state-of-the-art forward really helped change the paradigm there. And so this is something to think about. Like if you're going in and somebody's like, oh, we're good enough. We're the top in our space. Now, how do we compare to QuickBooks? And it's one of those things, like a lot of people, you go use QuickBooks Online, and if you love or hate Quicken and Intuit, it's a pretty amazing app for what it does and the flow. I mean, they have dialed that thing into a T. So you don't have to like it, you don't have to use it, but you can respect it for what it is and how it does it. So, current state of the art. What are our pain points? What are our problems? I've heard this so many times I can't count. There's some manager that thinks that if we just had Johnny Ive, all our product problems would be solved and we'd be making billions of dollars and our stock would be $250 a share. Well, Sir Jonathan Paul Ive, Knight Commander, Order of the British Empire, started off with amazing flock of seagulls hair at Newcastle Polytechnic. He had a little brief detour with a half zip and a mustache in the 80s, and then we've got serious business Johnny Ive in his blue shirt in the 90s. By the time you're getting, or in early aughts, when you get over to here, this is when the first color candy iMac stuff was starting to happen. And what was every single computer at that point? Beige boxes. It's hard to remember that for some of us, but there was only an inkling of the eMate. Was the only thing that we thought that showed where the future was going for Apple. And if you asked somebody at that point, no one would be like, yeah, everything's going to be like the eMate in 5 years. So he almost left Apple. He was so fed up and frustrated. So just having that one person that's the magical solution is not the way to do it. Building a process that lasts anybody, your whole design team could quit, but you've established an amazing process, that is going to help build design in your company. So often we have no direction. we have a lot of competing directions too sometimes. So it's just like, yeah, do this, or we could do that, or we could go there. Somebody needs to put a flag in the sand somewhere and say, there, we're going to that. You may have no team. You may be the only person that's dealing with the front end entirely in your product, and it's just I got to get it out the door, and this is what we're going to do. And in that case, you could have a lot of people, but you could be completely overloaded and understaffed. Or you're dealing with an outsourced team. Any of this starting to sound familiar? Or you've got an overloaded spec. All the things. This app will do all the things. Or you have an incomplete and out-of-date spec, which is pretty much what every product ends up with. So there's a couple ways we can fix this from our process. And the fixes start off with pods. Kill silos. Like I said, everybody wants that super secret designer unicorn guy, gal, whatever. No. Build pods around the product. Everyone working together, no silos. QA, product, project management, design, front-end development, back-end development. If you have DBAs, put them in there too. Everybody is working on that part of the product and is responsible for that part of the product's success or failure. Do some research. Shadow your users, if at all possible. There are lots of ways to do this. I know a lot of times it's hard to do it because you're doing a mobile app or something like that. But if you're working on a tool that you can go and watch someone use, do it. Living Social, we did that with our customer service, and sitting there watching them use they'd do double entry into a quick Rails app they'd built that was just scaffolded, and then they were also doing entry into a Salesforce management system for every single call. They had to type the same thing twice. Very quickly, we're like, that makes no sense. Why are we doing this? But no one, that was just how it's done. This is what we do. This is how you train the people to get it done. And they were throwing people at bad UI. So very quickly, we were able to pull all that stuff out, refactor, rebuild the whole app, push it forward. This is probably the most epic version of dog fooding I've ever seen. This is another Toyota engineer, the chief engineer for the Sienna, and they were getting hammered in the early 2000s on the minivan market. Honda Odyssey was just kicking them 5 ways a Sunday. 53,000 miles of driving all over the North American continent. And this guy figured out all these things that were frustrating with the car. And why do people not like this car? So sun glare is intense. Directions were hard because he didn't speak Spanish when he was driving in Mexico. Parallel parking was difficult. Turning radius was too small. It's all these little things that, when you're driving a car you think about, but then that would never get back to the company, so they never fixed it. So by dog fooding all over North America, all these things got fixed, and they brought it up to market parity in like 2005 or 6. So they doubled their sales basically by just trying to use the system. This is a lady I know out in San Francisco. Like, this is, if you got blue sky budget, man, give her a call. They go out and film people using products, like film, like camera, watching them, follow them around for days. It's fascinating to watch these things. They like make mini documentaries about people and products. Hopefully not the blue screen of death. Let's try to re-answer this. So they make these mini movies about people using products, and it's amazing to watch. And oh, come on. That's interesting. Let's see here. No, maybe. Ta-da! Okay. Where's the mouse now? That's the fun part to find, right? Ta-da! All right, back where we were. So they make these mini movies, and it's really awesome. But most of us don't have that blue sky budget, so this is a great tool you can install. Full Story actually runs, and it basically records the mouse movements and clicks on the screen. So you can basically play back whole sessions later and watch how people use your app, which is really, really fascinating to do. We use this at Procore, and it helped a lot trying to figure out, because people, when you're on the call with them, they're doing what you're telling them to. When you suddenly see that they're clicking and they're like going back and forth between the same screen, it's like, okay, they're trying to find something. Okay. So we've done some research, we've kind of talked to people, we're going to break these down into proto-personas, and these are not proto-personas. These are fancy, high-end artifacts that people charge money for, and that's not what we're going to do. We're going to do this. We're going to get an 8.5 by 11 piece of paper, go grab a ream from the copier center, get a Sharpie, draw some stick figures, give me a name, give me some demographics, give me behaviors, and give me needs and goals. Now we're going to put these all up on the wall, and then we're going to actually try and find real people that match these. Sometimes you're close, sometimes you're way off, and you're going to kind of revise that and go back and forth. Once you've established these people, you can start talking about how does Frank use the app? How does Michelle use the app? Yeah, and you start talking about this lifestyle flow. How do things, especially with mobile, what is happening before and after I use the app? These become really fascinating things about experience because it's not just the buttons are great, it's I'm sitting here trying to order a pizza while my 3-year-old is dragging at my leg and the other one is screaming. Okay, now that changes things a lot. It's a totally different experience, right? True story. Mental models. So Indy Young wrote this great book, Mental Models, and it's basically about taking all this information about how people do things and breaking it down into a way that you can start attacking it from a software perspective. So here's an example of somebody's morning routine. On the top, we have kind of tasks or things or events or things that people are doing, and on the bottom, they've applied products. So they've identified products that fit with that. And so this would then lead to starting to say, okay, how do we optimize this product for this task in this time? Is it narrow time? Is it a lot of time? Well, how can we do that? And I mean, this is a really short one. The one that I was working with her on something for Sybase at the time for the developer portal at Sybase, and it literally was a 20, what is that? 3 feet, so 36-inch roll that went down the hallway. It probably covered that whole wall, and it was of that size. It was just like tons and tons of things being broken down, and so we were taking parts of it and working on it. But these things can get very, very complex. Journey maps. This is talking about life cycle again, right? So here's a journey map of somebody with diabetes. You're going left to right, and you start to see different outcomes and different touch points and different things that happen. Here's another one where we're talking about an Uber customer. So the top half here is really the map, and then the bottom starts to talk about the screens and the interactions. This is the Smithsonian in DC. And we talk about here from the first time I've heard about the Smithsonian, when I decide to go to the Smithsonian, in the museum, how I get out of the museum, what I do at the museum, the next steps, what I do with my memories afterwards, and then honestly, that should go all the way back around, because me sharing my memories out on Instagram and Facebook is going to have someone else see that, and they may become inspired to go to the Smithsonian. So we've done a lot of research now, and now we're going to start saying hypotheses. So everyone, you've done an Agile story before? This seemed pretty familiar, yeah? Some eye rolls too there. So lean UX hypotheses are pretty similar, but a little different. Instead of feature focus, we're looking on outcome focus. So we will achieve that we're going to believe that we'll achieve a business outcome if Frank or Michelle can achieve the outcome they want with a feature. So by focusing on instead of just saying the feature, or to do this I have a feature, we say we get this outcome, typically revenue or signups or something that leads to revenue, but the user's getting a positive outcome here too. Take all these and we put them in a big table up on the wall or a whiteboard. And now you start to say which of these have the most business value, which of them are easiest to do, so difficulty and value, kind of XY axes. You start sticking those, and then you can start to say high value and high difficulty is typically a good place to start because it's going to take the most time, but you're going to get the biggest bang. Low value with a lot of intensity, poor place to work. You're not going to get business value out of that, even if the customers get a lot of value. So we start sketching. And I don't want you to use Photoshop. I don't want you to use Sketch. I want you to use paper, pen, markers, whiteboards, Post-it notes. Trace paper. This is how I do UI, architectural trace. Bad habits die hard. This is just a flow diagram. Here's something from Living Social where we actually went into an office because our offices were all meeting spaces. Everyone was an awful open floor plan, but the entire exterior was like the offices were turned into meeting and war rooms. We drew this up on the wall. This was just a quick interaction, and we went and built it immediately. There was no artifact. There was no formal approval process. We went in, we sketched it out as a team, and went right back. I started on the CSS. The developer started on the JavaScript. Done. You can also do some story mapping. So this is where we start to break things down. This kind of feels like a little bit like a Kanban board. The blue is broad ideas. Working with lists would be an example at the blue level. The next is green. So let's say review all my lists, or create or change a list. And then the yellow are tasks. Attach a photo to a list. Share this list with other people. These things start to map very closely now to our issues in GitHub or our tickets or whatever system you're using. And the personas are down here in the bottom left. Those are a little more formal, but still pretty lo-fi. And you can start to see the color shape maps to those cards. So we're starting to talk about who's going to use this feature, how's it going to get used. We can talk about storyboards. This is a big kind of flow perspective. Let's step through all the steps in our app here. Breaking that down smaller, we can start to do sketchboards or 6-ups. It's also, we'll talk about it in just a second, Crazy Eights, but this is, Adaptive Path came up with this in the 07 era, and it's basically 6 storyboard frames, and we talk about a flow. And now everybody's doing this. Engineers are doing this, product people are doing this, designers are doing this, and you do it really fast. So you say, okay, we're gonna walk through this flow and go ahead and do it, and you got 2 minutes. Everyone share, do it again, 2 minutes. Everyone share, do it again. So within 15 minutes, you've got a lot of cross-pollination of ideas and things, and you'll start to see the whole team that started here is all kind of gravitated down, and all these ideas start to come together and coalesce, where everyone's like, oh, I like that idea Frank had, or I like that idea Michelle had. We're going to go towards that. Crazy Eights is another way to do it. You can either do a flow, but what I most like to do with this is the way to break out of, like, this is how this screen should be. Give me 8 versions of that screen. Okay. After 4, it gets really hard. But the whole point is, I'm not going to put the button there. I'm not going to do this. What happens if this goes here? What happens if I invert this whole thing? Who knows? You try it, and then you start talking about it, and you say, yeah, I think this could be cool. I think that might work if we do this here. Again, 2 minutes, next. 2 minutes, next. Vision boards. I showed you the one from Procore earlier. This is what we did at Living Social. So I did 5 screens. This is 2 of them. This is before, it was a different UI than we ended up with, but the concept was trying to fix our internal tools, which were literally Rails scaffolded. There was nothing to them. And it was that, or it was Excel pivot tables. And basically duct tape and Microsoft Office runs the world. So pulling that stuff together and saying, here's what we could have as a potential thing. Now, we had kind of thrown this around with the end users and said, do you like this? Yeah, that looks cool. And of course, I put this in front of Aaron Battalion, and Aaron is not one to be short on comments. And he just kind of looked at it for a couple minutes, which worried the crap out of me, because he was silent. But he's like, this is 18 months of work, right? And I'm like, I'm not saying we're going to build this, but this is where we could go. This is like a potential place we could go with this. And like this one, same thing. This is a potential place where this app could end up. The app didn't end up there. It went through something similar to this, and it's radically different now, but it's a heck of a lot different than it used to be. And so we do a lot of this by sharing work, and this can be done virtually or in person, but this comes from architecture. You haven't slept for 3 days. You've been working nonstop on getting this design ready, and you put it up on the wall, and then you have a jury review it. No pressure. So, but the goal here is you don't need to pull all-nighters to do this at work. The goal here is to get the work up on a wall, and that could be something like InVision or some other kind of system like that, too, where everyone can go in and comment, and to get feedback and get ideas, and then you take it back and you revise it and you put it back up, and it's in a place where everyone can look at it all the time. So right now I'm working with one of our engineers at CargoSense is in Sao Paulo. The CTO is in Portland. I'm in Charlottesville, and one of the other developers is outside DC in Maryland. And so InVision is our source of truth. If I put the screen there, then that's where we're going to comment on it, that's where we're going to go back and forth on it, and that's what we build from. So any comments, you can send me an email. If it doesn't, you'll put it back in InVision. And I mean, very quickly, everybody got into that process. So we have one source of truth for what we're building and what we're working towards. Now, let's test these things. Clickable prototypes. So basically, just having something doesn't have to be hi-fi. can be done with JavaScript, but honestly, you can do this with a lot of other tools that are far quicker. Keynote, InVision, Marvel, XD now from Adobe, all these things have various ways of making something that you can actually deploy onto a phone and put in somebody's hand and have them touch through it. And so we have one that we're doing for a pet tracker right now, and you can actually go through the whole flow, clicking on the buttons and seeing what happens. And it's like, oh, that feels weird. Let's revise that flow. Let's go back and tweak that. So this comes down to across the board, all these things we've just talked about used to be UX deliverables. We're going to go to the mountain. We're going to come back and give you some wireframes. We're going to go to the mountain. We're going to come back and give you some mockups. And that's where failure happens. Instead, these deliverables should help drive the decisions. So by having everybody involved, you're getting a lot further. You're getting a lot more interaction. You're having a lot less of that back and forth. I'm not tossing something over the wall. It's everyone's been involved since day one. It's not a surprise anymore. So now we're going to test these things. A couple ways you can do this. If you're on Windows, Camtasia is a similar kind of system that'll get you a similar vibe. But what's so great about this is a test we did at Living Social. Jeannie here was the head of programming. So programming was the team that decided what deal ran on what day and for how long, and just kind of balancing out the offering, the product offering. So this is a JSON-backed, there's no backend, it's literally a flat file JSON-backed JavaScript app that we were testing with them. And so you can sit here and watch, and it records all her mouse, it records her screen and the camera looking at her. So you can watch where she's looking, and you can start to see that she likes to click and drag and try things out. And we go through the whole test, but instead of having 10 engineers around her, like, what you gonna do? What you gonna do now? You're gonna do now. It was just her with the product manager. It was a very comfortable thing. It was at her desk, on her system, and she was able to go through it and use it, and it was her natural environment. And then we were able to watch this, and I can still watch it, you know, now, this is what, 2012, so this is now 6 years later. I can still go back and watch this and see like what the feedback was. And there is sound of this, but the sound's irrelevant for you all watching this right now. But it was great because you could immediately say, oh, I expected, when I clicked that, I thought I'd see this, or, you know, and so, oh, okay, let's go take that back and work on that. Okay, but if you're like a little more guerrilla, a little more lo-fi, you don't have that, you can go to Starbucks, say, hey, I'll buy you a coffee if you can take a look at this real quick. Worst thing they'll say is no. And here's the kind of questions you're asking. You want to just be as open-ended as possible. If you say, you can do leading questions very easily in UX testing, and it's always the failure because then you're getting the answers you want. So what do you make of this? What would you do here? How would you do that? Trying to have it where they have to talk through the process to you is critical. You can also outsource this. Usertesting.com, there's a couple other places that do it too. But if you don't have budget or time to do it, from the sense of bringing in staff or hiring people, this is a good second option. But how many tests you need to do? Well, thank you, Jacob Nielsen, again, but there's a nice white paper out there from ACM 93, yeah, something 93, and the answer is 5. Any more than 5, you really don't get much of an ROI. So 5 people you can do in half a day. So any more than 5, you really don't have the ROI drops. So there's a great article here if you need to take this to management and say, this is industry standard. Now, there are other kinds of tests that 5 is not enough. So quantitative studies, when you literally are going for volume, you need about 20. Card sorts, which is a way to kind of say, like navigation, figuring out your nav is a great way to say what a card sort is, like which items go together. That's what card sorting is for. Eye tracking is obviously the biggest one. That's where they actually have a system that tracks where someone's looking on the screen, and they give you a heat map back, which can be really powerful if you're like, why does nobody find this button? Well, it's out of the zone where they're looking. Okay, well, let's move the button and see what happens. Now, once you've gotten through all this stuff, you're going to want to start to move towards a design system. And the design system is a single versioned source of design truth. This is code. At Living Social, we built this. This is when, this is again 2011, 2012, so this is early Bootstrap. We kind of took Bootstrap, we got rid of the class name attachment flow and did everything with Sass. But we had a basic setup that you could install a Ruby gem. Now we do it as a Bower package or something else along those lines. And it gave you this with 2 generators. You had all the basics of an app were there, and you could start building out your nav and all these things, and it would show up where it needed to be. We also had all the different elements at the time documented, and you could get to the documentation at a certain route in the app, only in development. So if you were running in development mode, you would just go up to the localhost 3000, type wild, W-I-L-D-E, like Oscar Wilde, and you would get this. And then you could click through to all the documentation, which was coming straight out of the code. So everyone always had up-to-date docs whenever they had, but it was for that version, because it was the version gem in the gem file serving the docs. So a lot of this stuff is stuff that you've seen derivatives of in Bootstrap. We did a little bit more playful stuff. So when we throw out bug errors and we throw out, instead of just you created a successful sale, it was, you did something with money, yay! It was a little more playful. And these things were built in, all the button styles, bringing all these across, making them sassified. And this is that double screen customer support app that we ended up redoing. So this is the finished version of that. And this actually ran the numbers with, we moved the agents out of DC to a new call center, so it was pretty much new hires in Phoenix. Agent SLAs went from 20% to 95%. Decreased call abandonment rate went from 20% to 4%. So we were having people just wouldn't even they'd be on hold so long they'd hang up. And we dropped that down. And then time to complete the case was cut by 20%. All with software, all with UI, all by looking at flows and improving them. Same thing here. This is another thing. All these things are built out of Wild. All these things are served out of the same design system. So all of these are custom elements that we start building and then we'd reuse. Here's something similar. This is actually built on top of Salesforce. We had 2 Apex engineers who were able to help us build this into Salesforce. So we styled Salesforce to look like our internal tools, to flow like our other internal tools. So now a lot of this stuff, patternlab.io, atomic design. Who's familiar with Brad Frost's atomic design? It's a great concept. You start talking about things, especially if you're working, I know we kind of joked about this a little bit, but if you're working in React, you kind of start talking about elements that have bigger elements that have bigger elements. And then there's Storybook.js, which is basically a source of truth for components. So now all the components live here and can all be documented and built here as elements that can then be brought into the app. So, okay, we've looked at a ton of stuff. It's very high level, kind of scattershot here we've done so far. So what's the focus? A couple things I want you to focus on as you go back. First of all, narrow down the iteration. Focus on very small things. This is a great book that kind of talks through that process. Jake Knapp is part of Google Ventures. He's part of their design wing at Google Ventures with Daniel Burka and a couple other guys. And this is a quote from Daniel. And its design temptation is to go into their fancy room and dream something up. But designers are, and finding UX people that are better about facilitating the process of design. When you're hiring, find people that are facilitators. They can be good visual designers and stuff too, but can they run a meeting? Can they help work with engineers? Can they speak engineer? Seriously, like this is why people are like, designers get all bent out of shape. They shouldn't learn half the code. If I can't speak to you in the language of construction, how can we ever have a conversation? Architects have to know how a wall detail is built. I don't have to go out there with the hammer or the trowel, but I have to know how that structure is put together. Same thing, I need to understand how a JavaScript app is built if I'm going to be designing for it, because otherwise I'm like, yeah, I don't know if we can do that. And you're asking the engineer, can I do that? I don't know, well, let's look at the code. So if a designer learns, they don't have to write the code, but they need to understand how code happens. This is the flow from from Sprint, I'm sorry. 5 days. You're done on Friday. You have a design, you have a product, you've prototyped it, you've tested. You get the decision maker on the calendar on Wednesday. They have to be there, they have to decide yes, no, go, no, go. You get to Friday, you take the weekend off, you come back, you start again. Very rapid, very quick, run it through. And you're doing, you're actually testing with people on Friday. You're not spending a lot of time on this. This is where Keynote or things like that really shine. because you can really quickly move elements around, make that a clickable thing, and it clicks to a different slide, and you've got this clickable prototype. And you can run that Keynote thing on the phone with Keynote app if you've got an iOS phone. So one of those cool little lo-fi hacks to get it delivered. Love your first-time user. So many times you load the screen in an app, and the first-time thing is just this big empty screen, a big empty index table. So, you know, this is a very complex financial screen from Procore, and this is with a whole bunch of data. But when you first start, that's what it looks like. Hi, you're new here. You have no stats, so we're going to grade that out on the right. So you know stats are going to show up here later. And hey, here's a video that talks about what submittals are and how they work in Procore. And here you go. Your call to action is to set up submittals, because that's what you need to do. That's the first thing we need you to do, is to set it up for this flow. So this I mean, you can apply this to almost any kind of workflow, right? So the first time I show up in this workflow, what do I need to do? Give me a quick little 2-minute video intro, something like that. Little screencast. Doesn't have to be a high production fidelity video here. We're not, you know, just a screencast. You can record walking through it real quick. Another thing that you guys should think about is, where am I and what am I supposed to do here? I want you to look at every door in this room. What's wrong with these? Besides that they're labeled, should be the first issue. Vertical handle means pull. Subconsciously, people think I grab it and I pull. Exterior doors in any commercial structure have to be one of two things. They have to open out, and if they don't, they have to break away. Chicago fire in 1905, people got pushed up against the doors of a theater, and tons of people died because they couldn't get out of the building. So that's why you'll see that right there, though. If you think about it, you walk up to it, you're not going to try and pull. You're going to push. Subconscious. So when you start looking at your app and you start looking at design things, is this clear? Is this button clear? Is this flow clear? Do I know what I'm supposed to do here? What is my call to action? This translates very directly to a software interface. And if the question is, I don't know, rev that, work that. Google doesn't do this very well anymore. I also didn't realize that I'd be speaking at the same time as Michael in his chatbot talk right next door, so. Clippy, for those of you who doesn't know who Clippy is, I'm actually curious. Oh, good. My wife was like, "You're old, honey." People. So, Clippy was the Microsoft Office assistant, and it was something where it would interrupt you saying, "Hey, it looks like you're trying to write a letter. You want some help?" And it drives everyone crazy. The problem is, this is exactly what we're doing with all sorts of pop-ups and notifications. And as much as I love intercom, there's like, "Hey, what's up? We're here. Ask us a question." Really annoys me. Other things. This popped up on my trip last week, and it popped up again, and I made a screenshot. So this, you know, it's like, send a Marco Polo to your wife. And I'm like, I'm sitting next to her. I don't need to send her a Marco Polo. Like, Marco Polo is a little video messaging app, for those of you who haven't used it. The Onion, unfortunately, is more accurate than a lot of news sites right now. But I'm sure all of you have seen these notifications where it's like, somebody posted and blah, 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 they haven't posted in a while. And I'm like, did I subscribe to their feed? No. So stop sending things that are not notifications as notifications. Please, 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 please. And I don't know if any of the Journey Group team is here, but they're out of Charlottesville, and they wrote this great article about creating users, not addicts. You should definitely give it a read, and especially if you guys work on a system that has this problem. Finally, 80% of design is typography. How many of you have seen this before, this phrase? So this phrase is used for fonts because it has every single letter in the alphabet. All 26 letters are represented here. Now, let's take it to Comic Sans. I love it. But really quickly, that's a different feel all of a sudden, isn't it? Now we're getting artsy. Now we're really getting artsy. But hey, let's do some like headline typography here, all right? Now what happens, let me just add some color. Now we've gone from this to that. Same content, that's the design. You don't need some fancy Photoshop graphic image. So much of good typography is really what makes a good design readable, enjoyable, and executable. So if you're going to spend time on the true design part of things, go read typography books. Stop Stealing Sheep and Learn How Type Works is a great one. And just kind of like start to understand fonts and font combinations. Like if you do that, you're going to be so much further ahead than so many designers out there. Because half the time there's 14 fonts, they don't match, the styles are all over the map, sizes change from page to page. And being able to sit there and say, hey, you know, we need to bring our UI into some consistency here. Let's bring these styles down. Line, this is called leading. So leading, literally in typography, they used to have thin pieces of lead they'd put between the rows of type to increase the spacing between lines in the old presses. So we still use all these old words from manual presses, but on the left it feels very compressed. Same exact thing spaced out, same font size on the right, just spaced out. Little things like this make big differences in readability and enjoyability of a product. So I'll leave you with 2 quotes, and we can get on to the end of the day. So, famous St. Exupéry quote, a designer knows that there's nothing, not when there's nothing left to add, when there's nothing left to take away. Boil it down, does it still work? Was that stuff really important? That's a question to ask. And then, Marvel this is not Marvel. This is not the Marvel style guide is in the DC versus Marvel kind of thing. This is Marvel, the UI product. But design is just a problem solving within a set of constraints. So if you think about those constraints, if you are working greenfield, make constraints. If you don't have them, you will go nuts because everything's possible. And to end, I want to tell you again, UX debt is technical debt. Don't let that backlog get built up. Make tickets in GitHub for UX stuff. Give it a count the same way you do with a Fibonacci sequence or however else you count your hours. Do the exact same thing for your UX work, because you guys as engineers should be sitting in on that. That is your time. So if it's going to be that everyone's sitting in a room for an hour, you guys should track that as a ticket. You should track it as something that is part of the work, and it counts towards the total work. So here were the four of the books that I really recommend if you're interested. Creativity Inc. really is kind of just how, like if you're having problems as a company with your creative management and how the team is working, there's a lot of gems in there. The UX team of one, so many of us end up working in a space where we don't have the resources or can't have the resources. And Leah Bewley wrote this amazing book that kind of says, here's your toolkit. And it's from Rosenfeld Media, it's phenomenal. Sprint and then Lean UX. Lean UX is now in its 2nd edition, and it's like, I've read this thing like 5 or 6 times, and I keep getting new ideas every time I read it. It's great. It's just wonderful. And I've been working on something for a while that hopefully will launch early next year, but basically taking this, if you liked the content here, we'd be doing 7 hours of deep dive on that content. So there's a quiz, roughly, survey, quiz, it's kind of a quiz. But basically, like, what would you want to see in classes like that? So let me know. You'll be notified when it launches. If you don't have to put your email in, but you'll be notified if you're. So the slides are up there. All right, thank you guys.